In the pre-dawn quiet of April 20th, 1991, flames devoured a centuries-old cottage in the English countryside. Inside, a once great rock vocalist, Steve Marriott, stumbled through black smoke, trying to escape the inferno he'd unwittingly started. It was a grim final chapter to a life lived at full volume, a child actor turned mod teenage icon, a small face with a towering voice, a 1970s rock god who packed arenas, and a restless soul haunted by bad deals and bad habits. He soared to fame, crashed to ruin, and died far too young, in a blaze of both glory and tragedy. His story is one of rise and fall, of brilliant music and broken promises, of a fire that burned bright before burning out. Welcome to Rock and Roll Mysteries. Steve Marriott entered the world 3 weeks premature on January 30th, 1947, a tiny and sickly baby who spent his first month in an East London hospital. He was the only child of Bill and Kay Marriott, working-class parents in London's bomb-scarred East End. Little Stevie might have come into life frail, but he quickly grew into a hyperactive kid with an outsized personality. The family recall him as a born performer and an energetic prankster who once even claimed to have set his school classroom on fire as a joke. Years later, his mother admitted that particular tale was invented for laughs, but it stuck as outrageous stories around Steve often did. What's undeniably true is that from an early age he wanted the spotlight. While he was still just a boy, Steve was busking at bus stops and winning talent contests at seaside holiday camps with his ukulele and harmonica. He had music in his bones, inherited perhaps from his dad, Bill, a pub pianist who taught him the joys of a good tune and a right old knees up. Steve's first addiction was applause. At 13, he landed a role in London's West End, playing the Artful Dodger in Oliver. Night after night, he soaked up the cheers on stage, a Cockney kid with a cheeky grin and a big voice. This early brush with showbiz success lit a fire in him that never went out. Once I heard that crowd, I had to have more, he later said. Though he dabbled in acting, even appearing in a couple of films and plays, music was truly his calling. In 1963, at just 16, he cut his first single, which was a pretty forgettable pop song, and formed a band called The Moments. They went out hustling for gigs on the London pub circuit. Small in stature, he'd top out at about 5'5" as an adult. Steve nonetheless commanded attention with a voice that could rattle the rafters. He had bags of confidence and was more than capable of belting out soul covers anywhere that would have him. That powerhouse soul voice was so good you'd swear it belonged to someone twice his size and age. It also became his ticket out of East Ham's working-class grind. By his late teens, Steve was a young man in a hurry, hungry for more than pub stages and minor singles, ready to make the leap to rock and roll glory. In 1965, fate walked into a music shop in Manor Park in the shape of two fellow East End lads, Ronnie Lane and Kenny Jones. Steve met Ronnie and Kenny by chance. The story goes that he was working in the back of the shop selling guitars, and they bonded over a shared love of American R&B and a desire to form a band. They added Jimmy Winston on keyboards, and with Marriott on guitar and explosive vocals, the lineup was already set. A girl down the pub quipped they should call themselves the Small Faces. Small because none of them topped 5 feet 6 inches, and Faces was mod slang for the coolest of the cool. The name stuck, and soon so did their reputation. Within weeks of forming, the Small Faces had secured the management of notorious impresario Don Arden, known as the Al Capone of pop for his brutal business tactics. Arden hustled them a deal with Decca, and by late '65, their debut single, What You Gonna Do About It, was in the UK top 20. 4 kids from East London had suddenly become Britain's hottest new mod band, sharp-suited, shag-haired teen idols who sparked mod mania wherever they played. But early success came at a price. As crowds of screaming fans chased them, they famously had to flee in the back of a fish truck once to escape a mob. The Small Faces quickly learned they had little control over their own destiny. Manager Arden treated them as his personal goldmine. He paid the band paltry wages while he tooled around in a chauffeured Rolls Royce. The band later claimed Arden kept their earnings and alleged he was corrupt, even spending £12,000 of his own money to bribe their song up the charts. "We toured our asses off and saw none of the money," Marriott recalled bitterly. At 18, he was already feeling the squeeze of the industry's darker side. Arden's motto, as the band would later learn, was always fuck the artist before the artist can fuck you. It wouldn't be the last time Steve got royally cheated in his career. But for now, the teenagers in the Small Faces were riding high on the pop charts, naively trusting their management and living the high life on tour, even if their bank accounts didn't show it. Even as Steve Marriott commanded stages and flirted with superstardom, his personal life was a roller coaster of romance and turmoil, often intertwined with his music. In 1966, at the zenith of Small Faces fame, Steve met Jenny Rylance, a stunning young model. He was instantly smitten, quote, "in love from the moment I saw her," he admitted. But Jenny was dating a rising rocker named Rod Stewart at the time. Steve settled for becoming her mate, but he was biding his time. When Jenny's fling with Rod fizzled out, Steve seized the chance. A bit heartbroken after losing Rod, she dated Steve before unceremoniously dropping him when Rod came calling again. This time it was Steve who was heartbroken, but he had a master plan. He courted her with one of his greatest songs, Tin Soldier, written explicitly to declare his devotion and win her back from his rival. The ploy worked. Jenny realised Steve's feelings were true, and by 1968, she became Mrs. Marriott. For a while, she was the steady force in his chaotic world, the elegant rock wife standing side stage while Steve belted out her song to thousands. Musically, Steve Marriott was coming into his own during the Small Faces' whirlwind rise. He and Ronnie Lane penned the raucous All or Nothing, inspired by one of Steve's rocky love affairs, and it shot to #1 on the UK charts in September 1966. Marriott's soulful sandpaper voice on that track, alternately tender and blazing, made teenage girls swoon and fellow rock singers stare in awe. "One of the finest white soul voices ever," is how he was described in the press, and they weren't wrong. Other hits quickly followed. The stomping Sha-La-La-La-Lee, which Steve despised as too bubblegum, the dreamy Itchy Coo Park, and of course the ferocious Tin Soldier. On stage, the Small Faces were dynamite. Marriott would howl and strut, windmill his guitar and knock over mic stands, giving audiences a wild show that belied his diminutive stature. In mod culture, he became an icon, the Cockney with Carnaby Street style and a voice of pure fire. Photographers loved him, always grinning or pulling faces, often with a cigarette dangling from his lip and eyes twinkling with mischief. Yet even as their fame grew, cracks were forming behind the scenes. The band members were barely out of their teens and getting pissed off under Don Arden's dictatorial control, not to mention being still stone broke despite their hits. They eventually dumped Arden for a new manager, which prompted Arden to respond in East End gangland tradition. He and his lads paid a visit to the new manager's office and allegedly dangled him out of a window, warning him off the Small Faces. It was mod mafia, a brutal act that could have been invented by the Cray twins, and it scared the hell out of the young band. By 1967, they signed with the respected Andrew Loog Oldham's Immediate Records and tasted more creative freedom. As with many others that year, the Small Faces started embracing psychedelic experimentation, and this culminated in their ambitious 1968 concept album, Ogden's Nut Gone Flake, a whimsical masterpiece that topped the UK charts. But if Ogden's proved to be their artistic peak, it also hastened their end. The complex songs were nearly impossible to recreate live, and Steve in particular was getting restless. He was always wanting to push harder and go louder. By late 1968, Marriott felt the Small Faces had gone as far as they could. He wanted to play heavier rock and reportedly even tried to bring his friend Peter Frampton into the group, an idea the others shot down. To them, Small Faces was a tight brotherhood. To Steve, it was becoming a bit of a straitjacket. Tension simmered, and on New Year's Eve 1968, it finally exploded. The Small Faces were mid-set at London's Alexandra Palace, playing a gig that was meant to ring in a hopeful new year. Instead, it rang the death knell for the band. Marriott, frustrated and fed up, abruptly stopped playing in the middle of a song and threw down his guitar. He shouted 2 words, which were either, "I quit," or more likely, "That's it," depending on who you ask, before storming off stage in front of a shocked crowd. The audience stood dumbstruck, and his bandmates were left blinking in disbelief as their lead singer vanished into the New Year's night. Steve Marriott was done with the Small Faces. In that dramatic moment, one of Britain's brightest bands was effectively over. Marriott's walk-off would become legend, the kind of impulsive, bridge-burning move only a young rock star at his wits' end would pull. Years later, drummer Kenny Jones lamented that Steve hadn't held on. "If only we'd stuck together, we could have reached greater and heavier things," he said. But Marriott's mind was made up. He was already envisioning a new musical direction, one with bigger amplifiers, bluesier riffs, and no creative compromises. Just days after his fiery exit from Small Faces, Steve Marriott was planning his next act. He quickly reunited with Peter Frampton, the talented young guitarist he'd befriended on the London scene, and roped in bassist Greg Ridley from Spooky Tooth and a 17-year-old drum prodigy, Jerry Shirley. This new supergroup, christened Humble Pie, would be Marriott's vehicle to unleash the harder-edge rock he craved. In early 1969, the four headed to a country cottage to jam, and what emerged was a potent blend of blues, soul, and bone-rattling rock and roll. Humble Pie's debut single, Natural Born Boogie, a boogie rock toe tapper written by Steve, hit the UK top 5 in 1969, and this proved Marriott could still deliver hits. But more importantly, the band found success in the United States, where their Small Faces had been largely unknown. Frampton's clean-cut looks and guitar skill, combined with Marriott's lung-busting vocals, made Humble Pie a formidable live act. By 1971, they were packing American arenas and earning a reputation as one of the loudest, greasiest hard rock bands around. On stage, Marriott was unleashed. Freed from the pop expectations of his old band, he transformed into a rock and roll wild man, screaming bluesy lyrics, wailing on guitar, and egging on audiences like a revival preacher at a biker bar. Humble Pie's concerts were sweaty, explosive affairs often stretching past the 2-hour mark with jammed-out blues numbers. Their 1971 double live album, Performance, Rockin' the Fillmore, captured this magic and became a bestseller and FM radio staple, especially the epic 16-minute I Don't Need No Doctor. Marriott's voice on that record is positively feral. He howls, moans, and testifies like a man possessed, sending shivers down listeners' spines more than half a century later. Peter Frampton himself has admitted, Humble Pie was simply the best band I was ever in. For Marriott, finally headlining American tours and hearing 20,000 American fans roar at his vocals, it must have felt like vindication. This was the high life he had dreamed of, rock stardom on his own terms, free of teeny bopper image or mod pigeonholes. But with the high life came high living, and Steve dove headlong into the excesses of the early 70s rock scene. Humble Pie's American manager, D. Anthony, encouraged their hard partying lifestyle. He literally plied them with drugs and booze while negotiating contracts. One notorious meeting in 1972 had the band signing a lucrative new record deal, while a platter piled with a pyramid of top-grade cocaine made the rounds in the opposite direction. "We were far more interested in the progress of the plate," drummer Jerry Shirley later quipped, recalling how the suited record execs watched as the band members got snowblind on coke and inked the papers. "Breaks every rule, do not sign high, always sign straight. So we only have ourselves to blame," Shirley admitted wryly. Under the neon haze of fame, Marriott's vices were growing. He developed a prodigious appetite for cocaine and downers, often going on for days on end. He would go on 5 or 6 day benders where he wouldn't even think of sleeping, Jerry Shirley remembered. He proudly called himself 5-Day Marriott, when in fact he was dying inside. The drugs exacerbated Marriott's mercurial temper and ego. On tour he could be funny and charming one minute, then raging or irrational the next, a pattern friends came to recognise as Melvin, Steve's drug-fueled alter ego taking over. Cocaine psychosis crept in. He'd get paranoid or aggressive, straining relationships with his bandmates. Musically, Humble Pie hit a peak with the album Smokin' in 1972, which went top 10 in the US behind swaggering tracks like 30 Days in the Hole. That song in particular, a raunchy ode to sex, weed, cocaine and jail time, became one of Marriott's signature tunes and an anthem of rock and roll excess. Steve actually wrote it after learning a minor drug bust in Kentucky could literally land you 30 days in the hole, or in other words, jail. The lyrics also reference Durban poison marijuana and Newcastle brown, slang for heroin, not the Geordie beer, and this showed how the drug scene had turned darker by the 70s. On Smokin', Steve's voice was at its grittiest, and the album's success gave the band momentum. But by then, Peter Frampton had already left the group in 1971, after becoming weary of the relentless tours and drug scene. This, of course, was right before his own solo career skyrocketed. Without Frampton's presence, Humble Pie became even more Steve's show, and not always for the better. He hired a trio of flashy female backing singers, the Blackberries, and started indulging his love of American soul and funk on stage, stretching songs into James Brown-style R&B reviews. Steve was living out this James Brown fantasy, only he'd taken it one step too far, Jerry Shirley observed, of their 1974 tours. Some fans loved it, others were turned off by the bloated jams and perceived self-indulgence. By 1975, after a couple of mediocre selling albums, Humble Pie imploded under the weight of internal quarrels, drugs and dwindling creativity. Their final years were marked by arguments and disarray. During sessions, the band members were barely speaking and often recorded their parts separately. Marriott's behaviour had grown erratic and overbearing, hostile and tyrannical. When Humble Pie finally split, it wasn't with a bang, but a whimper. One by one, the members drifted off until Steve was the only one left standing. He was 28 years old, a twice conqueror of the rock scene, but his demons were catching up fast. The first victim was his marriage. Life with a rock and roll urgent child like Steve Marriott was never going to be tranquil. As the small faces gave way to Humble Pie, the pressures and temptations multiplied. Jenny tried to hold on through the wild tours and the nights when Steve wouldn't come home. For a few years, she stuck by Steve through everything, the fame, the fights, the binges. But by 1973, she'd endured enough chaos. Marriott's descent into coke-fueled self-destruction broke her heart. She later confided that watching him high and out of control, night after night, finally forced her hand. She left him, filing for divorce after 5 stormy years of marriage. It was a devastating blow for Steve. Jenny had been his muse and anchor. Losing her sent him into an even darker spiral of drugs and despair. He would later blame himself, admitting his substance abuse drove her away. Marriott hit rock bottom personally around the same time that Humble Pie was falling apart. Without Jenny or the band, he was unmoored, a hard-living rock star suddenly adrift. But Steve was nothing if not a survivor, and by mid-decade, he clawed back some stability. In 1975, he crossed paths with Pam Stevens, a British Airways flight attendant with a warm and welcoming smile. She wasn't part of the rock circus, and perhaps that normalcy attracted him. They fell quickly in love. By the next year, Pam gave birth to Steve's first son, Toby, and Marriott at 29 found himself doing something he'd rarely done before, settling down at least a bit. He married Pam and moved to California for a fresh start. For a while in the late 70s, Steve lived in the US, trying to dodge a massive UK tax bill and to escape some of his bad habits. But you can't run from yourself for long. His old demons tagged along on the flight overseas. The late 1970s saw Marriott's fortunes collapse in a way that would be unbelievable if it weren't true. All those hit records and sold-out tours had not translated into financial security. Far from it. First, the Immediate Records label went bust in 1970, meaning Steve and his bandmates received no royalties for decades on their 60s hits. Then, his humble pie years came back to bite him. Manager D. Anthony had mismanaged or outright stolen much of the band's earnings. Steve belatedly discovered that Anthony hadn't paid the taxes he was supposed to on Marriott's behalf, leaving Steve owing the British taxman around £100,000 in back taxes. It was a staggering debt that he simply couldn't pay. Overnight, Marriott was essentially bankrupt. He felt double-crossed, first by Don Arden in the 60s, now by D. Anthony in the 70s. So, desperate to avoid charges for tax evasion, Marriott's California life was essentially that of a tax exile. Even in America, money was scarce. By the late 70s, Steve, the former chart topper, was literally scavenging to survive. Neighbors in California recall seeing the once famous rocker sneaking into their vegetable patches to steal a few carrots and potatoes for dinner. He would collect empty glass bottles to cash in the recycling deposits for a few cents. It was a shocking fall from grace. It's hard to imagine Paul McCartney busking for change or Ray Davies asking you to buy him a drink. Steve was of the same magnitude, at least in his home country, and now he was destitute. Marriott's pride took a beating, but his survival instincts kept him going. He even swallowed enough pride to call his old Humble Pie drummer after a promoter had offered a hefty sum for a Humble Pie reunion. Jerry Shirley got a phone call out of the blue in 1979, with Steve pitching the idea of getting the band back together. Jerry, perhaps out of loyalty or his own need of a bit of money, agreed, and for a brief moment Marriott saw a glimmer of hope and cash. They managed to record 2 forgettable albums and do some shows, but Steve's problems travelled with him. He showed up to rehearsal with his wrist in a cast after drunkenly slamming it in a door. He fought with bandmates and was clearly still using. Humble Pie Mark II crumbled by 1981, a pale shadow of its former self. To add to his woes, Steve's second marriage was imploding just as the reunion did. Pam had tolerated a lot, the transatlantic moves, the instability, Steve's inability to exorcise his bad habits, but the final straw was brutal. She discovered Steve was having an affair with another woman, Terry, who was now pregnant with Steve's child. It was the ultimate betrayal. In 1983, Pam divorced him, taking young Toby with her. Marriott was now twice divorced, nearly penniless, and with a reputation so volatile that major labels and promoters considered him more trouble than he was worth. The end of the decade found him sleeping in spare rooms, including for a bit at his sister Kay's humble house in Essex, hiding from creditors and the tax authorities, and turning down any music business offer that smelled the least bit fishy. By this time, he had eaten many mouthfuls of Humble Pie. The band name was becoming something beyond ironic. After being burned by so many suits, Steve also became openly hostile to managers and record execs. He famously blew off lucrative record deals in the 80s, preferring to gig on his own terms, a stance that left potential bandmates fuming when he sabotaged their big break. But Marriott had had enough of sharks. Chastened by the big-time music industry, Steve Marriott found himself back where he started, playing small clubs and pubs for a living. In the early 1980s, he formed a no-frills blues rock trio he named Packet of Three, a euphemism for condoms in the UK. He was hoping the band might be a prophylactic against any more self-inflicted bad juju. With Packet of Three, Steve toured the pub circuit around London and Essex, belting out blues standards and old Small Faces and Pie tunes to crowds of a few hundred die-hard fans. For the first time in ages, he didn't have to worry about managers or image or any artifice. It was just him, a guitar, and raw music in smoky bars. I've got what I wanted, which is just enough money to live on, in no great style but in a nice way, and respect from other musicians, playing the pubs where the music's still real, he reflected contentedly. Marriott was bruised by the business, but not broken. In fact, on a good night with a pint in hand and a guitar amp cranked behind him, he seemed as happy as ever. Jerry Shirley, who briefly joined Packet of Three in the mid-80s, recalled, I tried to motivate him to aim higher, but he was happy. He just wanted to play Jimmy Reed tunes all night. And why not? The fire-breathing frontman of Humble Pie had become something like a local bluesman, albeit a London variant, and in many ways, it suited him. Amid this return to roots, Steve's personal life took a turn for the better, at least for a while. In 1985, he reconnected with an old friend, Manon Piercy, who provided the kind of steady companionship he desperately needed. Manon helped Steve cut back on the drink and drugs to a degree, and even got him to care about his health a bit more. They settled into a quiet life in England, and that same year welcomed a daughter, Molly May Marriott, born in 1985. Becoming a father again in his late 30s softened Steve. Friends saw him doting on baby Molly, crooning lullabies in that soulful voice that could just as easily shake the walls. But alas, Marriott's wandering heart didn't allow this calm phase to last. The very year his daughter was born, Steve strayed embarking on a new romance with a young fan named Tony Polton, whom he met at a gig. By 1986, he had split with Manon and moved in with Tony, a woman 2 decades his junior, trading one relationship for another at dizzying speed. He and Tony married in 1989, giving Steve his 3rd trip to the altar. He believed this time he'd found the right partner, someone who adored him not as a fading star, but as a person, flaws and all. As the new decade dawned, there were faint glimmers of a career renaissance on Steve's horizon. The nostalgia wave for 60s music was building, and bands like Small Faces were being rediscovered by a new generation of Britpop and mod revival fans. In 1991, Steve entertained an intriguing proposal from his old friend Peter Frampton, who by then was long past his 70s megastardom and keen to make some authentic music again. Frampton was putting together a new band and realised, quote, "No one would fit because I was looking for a Marriott." He called Steve up to suggest they write songs together and perhaps record an album, essentially a Humble Pie reboot of sorts. Marriott's eyes lit up at the idea. "Fuck me, yeah, that would be good, wouldn't it?" he exclaimed to Frampton on the phone. For the first time in years, Steve allowed himself to dream of a comeback on a big stage. In early 1991, Frampton flew to England, and the 2 old bandmates jammed, cranked out a couple of new songs, and made plans to continue their collaboration in California. Record labels were sniffing around with interest, a Frampton/Marriott project had commercial promise, and it looked like Steve might finally escape the pub circuit. But the old problems lingered. Frampton had cleaned up his act. Steve really hadn't. During the writing sessions, Frampton grew frustrated that Marriott still wanted to party like it was 1971. "For me, work is fun, but recreation is for weekends. Steve didn't like that I was the guy that didn't indulge. We had labels after us, but he just decided he wasn't going to be part of it," Frampton said. Marriott bailed on the project almost as suddenly as he'd embraced it, maybe intimidated by the structure and sobriety it required. Frampton figured they'd take a short break and then resume talks, but time was not on their side. In April 1991, Steve flew to America to jam once more with Frampton, then returned to England with his wife Tony on April 19th. On the plane back home, things were tense. Steve drank heavily throughout the transatlantic flight, bickering with Tony in a way that alarmed fellow passengers. The two were heard arguing loudly in their seats, a continuation of spats they'd been having for months. They had dinner with friends after landing, then crashed at an acquaintance's house for the night. But even in the guest bedroom, Steve and Tony kept quarrelling under the influence of alcohol. In the wee hours, a drunken Marriott grew restless. Unbeknownst to Tony, he slipped out and called a taxi to take him to his cottage in Arkersden, Essex, preferring to sleep in his own bed that night. It was a fateful decision, and a fatal one. Just before dawn on April the 20th, 1991, a passerby spotted flames consuming the roof of Marriott's 16th century cottage and called the fire brigade. By the time firefighters arrived, the house was an inferno. They battled the blaze and eventually found Steve's body on the floor of his bedroom, wedged between the bed and a wall. He was 44 years old and had died of smoke inhalation. It appeared Steve woke to a house full of smoke and disoriented, and likely still intoxicated or sedated by drink and jet lag, crawled in the wrong direction, away from the exit. The official inquest determined that the fire was caused by a carelessly discarded cigarette, Steve's own. After that contentious flight, he'd come home, probably lit a last smoke in bed to relax, and then fallen asleep. The rocker who had cheated death through countless close shaves was finally done in by the most mundane rock and roll cliché, a cigarette in bed starting a fire. It was devastating, Jerry Shirley said of the news, though not entirely shocking given Marriott's history. We used to check his bunk on tour and take the cigarette out of his hand if he'd nodded off, Shirley revealed. Knowing Steve's habit of smoking in bed was a disaster waiting to happen. In fact, Steve had narrowly avoided setting himself ablaze several times before. I thought he was indestructible. He'd survived so many close shaves, Jerry said, but this time his luck ran out. Marriott's tragic death made headlines around the world, a grim postscript to a brilliant yet tumultuous life. Fans and friends were heartbroken but not entirely surprised. Some called him the rock star who refused to grow up, whose excesses finally caught up to him. In a poignant touch, the song All or Nothing, which Steve had taken to #1 in his youth, was played at his funeral as a final goodbye. Mourners included his old bandmates Kenny Jones and Peter Frampton, paying respects to the diminutive giant with the voice that had touched millions. Though Steve Marriott's story ended in tragedy, his music lives on with a vitality that even fire couldn't extinguish. He left behind a legacy of genre-defining songs and an influence that echoes in every British rock singer who ever tried to belt a raspy high note. The man who once said, "I was seduced by fame at 18, and it paled very quickly. It had nothing to do with music," ultimately found his peace playing real music for its own sake, away from the limelight. He was a rock and roll lifer, flawed, passionate, and authentic to the end. Steve had one of the greatest voices God gave a white man, said Humble Pie's bassist Greg Ridley, and Paul McCartney once remarked that if he could sing like someone else, it would be Steve Marriott. Steve's life was one of soaring highs and crushing lows, soul-stirring music and self-sabotage. It's the kind of story that rock mythology is built upon, immensely talented, yet tragically troubled. From East End street kid to mod idol, from humble pie to humble end, Steve's tale remains as gripping as the wail of his guitar and the raw power of his voice. He truly gave all or nothing, and that is rock and roll mystery enough for any lifetime. All right then, why don't you let me know in the comments if you are more familiar with Steve's work with Humble Pie, or with the Small Faces, or maybe you like both. Let me know your favourite tune either way. I'd love to hear about that. Now here's a bit of news that some of you might even be pleased to hear. I'm going to be stepping aside from the narration for a while to concentrate on researching and writing the scripts. There's just not enough coffee in London to keep me going through 2 full channels, apparently. So, I'd like to introduce an old mate of mine who we all know as Johnny Milk, and he's a very knowledgeable fellow when it comes to rock, soul, blues, punk, weird history, movies and the rest. So you'll be in good hands.
Cheers, Chester. Well, I'm very happy to be joining up and doing a bit of narration here on Rock and Roll Mysteries and over on Society Mysteries. Some big and very shiny shoes to fill. And yeah, let me introduce myself. My name's Johnny, and like Chester, I'm a big music, movie and history nerd from London, and we've been mates for a long time, many years. Well, I hope you all don't mind the change too much, but I'm delighted to be stepping in and allowing poor Chezza a bit of extra sleep at night.
Nice one, Johnny. But let's clear it up. Why do we call you Johnny Milk? Because you always deliver, mate.
I thought it was because I always bottled it, but there you go. Who knows? It's one of those mysteries, but that's me, as far as I can remember now. Johnny Milk. Nice to meet you all. Hope you'll enjoy the show just as much as before.
Well, there you go. Johnny will be back next week with an episode on one of the most requested figures from the 60s. So look forward to that. If you still want to hear from me, I'll be continuing the Patreon show. So you can sign up to that if you like. It's just a couple of quid a month. More details in the description. But for now, I've been Chester, and I'll see you when I see you. Cheers.